Introduction. Hi, I'm Dale Doherty. I am here with three gentlemen that now work at Ford, two of whom used to be involved deeply with TechShop, and Jeff Surgis, also in Detroit, as now at Ford. But we were just talking about the early maker spaces that they created there. We just got started. So Jeff, you had OmniCorp, which always was kind of a fun name. And then you started Mount Elliott.
Yeah, and I may have mispronounced OmniCorp for a long time because people always tell me it's OmniCorp. And it's like, well, that's if it's the Marine Corps. But I was like, Omni Corporation, which is where we were shooting for, hence the RoboCop thing. But at the same time, I was trying to start the, and did start the Mount Elliott Makerspace. And so those were exciting times. And it was really helpful to have Maker Faire in Detroit that same year because all those things started up that year. Yeah,
it really did. And it brought some connection to a lot of different efforts that were happening there. So when did you get hired at Ford here?
I was hired this past fall. Although, man, I really had to beat the door down. I mean, kind of like Jim's story, which I hope we go back to. I did follow up. Actually, it was Mike Kuniavsky, if I'm pronouncing his name right.
Yeah, I remember
Sketching
Mike.
and Hardware.
He
introduced me to somebody at Ford. I got an interview for a position. And, a few interviews later, but still they said, oh, not for that position, but maybe for this other position. And even then I just had to keep banging the door down and finally got in. So, but they wanted me to open up their makerspace because they had bought the TechShop assets at the building next door. And I was like, well, I can do that, but I actually know this guy who will do it way better than me. And that's this guy down here in this square. I hope that's the square I'm playing for everybody. Probably not. It's wherever it is for everybody.
It's all relative.
It's the ginger-looking guy.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, that'll give us a way to go over and say hi to Will Brick. Will, looks like you're on a farm. Are you? You might have to unmute yourself, Will. He's not only on a farm, but he's on a bad Wi-Fi. There he goes. There you go.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
Yeah,
that's all right.
I'm making today, and today I'm making a hole in the ground.
Oh, very good. Got an excavator.
These are the things that happen when you leave me alone for a long weekend. Yeah. I haven't decided yet what to put in the hole.
Okay.
But it's deep and it's large, and I like it. No, it's actually going to be a drainage system.
Oh.
So I get ideas. No, not a pool. No, I get ideas, and I usually rope in the assistance of heavy machinery. And good times are ahead.
Yeah. So Ford had a relationship with TechShop. They helped underwrite the launch of a makerspace in Dearborn. And were you the first general manager there, or what was your role?
Yeah, I joined TechShop in April of 2010, and that was just as the shop in San Francisco had been opened a few months earlier, and the shop in San Jose was under construction and getting close to its opening. So sort of leading up to that moment, I had become aware of TechShop and Maker Faire, coincidentally, just about the same time, from two different friends in two different parts of the country simultaneously. And they sent me a message, said, have you ever heard of this TechShop thing? And sent a link to a series of YouTube videos of Jim giving a tour of the original TechShop building when it was, still mostly empty. And he was describing how it was going to work and where things were going to be, and demoing a few pieces of, or at least talking about a few pieces of equipment that were around the building. And I watched that series of videos and then emailed my friends back and said, if I had a membership to this place, I would completely abuse my privileges. So it really hit a chord with me. And the moral conundrum that I had was, well, do I move to become a member? I really like Detroit. I've really got roots here. I really, would like to contribute to this city coming back in a good way. Maybe I could be part of bringing TechShop here. So internet stalking and a visit to Maker Faire scored me a meet with Jim. And to make a long story short, I joined in 2010 and took up the final design of TechShop Detroit, the build, the launch, and almost 7 years of operation. And in the course of running that spot, we had we were right on the Ford campus. You know, we were an open to the public shop, but we were tied in a very close way with innovation programs at Ford. One in particular called the Patent Incentive Award Program, where Ford employees were given memberships and class training as a reward for submitting novel invention ideas that were patentable quality. So that was really, really interesting. And over those 7 years, we built relationships with, you know, all sorts of makers in the community and makers within the Ford community. So when TechShop had to close down, you know, there was a period of time where we weren't really sure what was going to come, what was going to happen with the assets. You know, we'd locked it up, we'd mothballed it. Ford was our landlord. They graciously let me come by and, you know, check up on it, you know, every few months. But otherwise, they sat on it. And then just this past August, they officially bought the assets of the shop. And Jeff Sturgis called me one day to let me know. Same day I got the letter in the mail from the from the bankruptcy court to say, you know, Ford is going to make this offer. You know, if you choose to object, you have 30 days to do it. And I, you know, held my breath, hoping no one would object. And so I started with D Ford this past January, and you know, what I imagined I would be doing up to this point is focusing on reopening the tech shop. Initially as a D Ford prototyping lab, but I know what it used to be, and I'd like to see it become much more than that over time. But of course, fate had something else in store for us.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I
just
that work.
yeah, we'll come back to that, because we just had a talk earlier today by Guy Cavalcanti, who leads the open source medical supplies group, and you know, we're 75 days from when he, you know, posted a message about a Facebook group in responding to this. And, you know, I said to him, I said, you know, 90 days ago, we didn't know any of us would be doing these things, right? So it's really almost a chronicle of what people have been doing this. And so let's ask, what is D Ford about? It's kind of like, before March, you guys were hired to do a number of things. Will, you described it a little bit already to maybe get the tech shop back up and running. But Jeff and Jim, what were you guys involved in? You know, not that much specifics, but just kind of what kind of, how you know, I also wanted to make the point that probably, you know, a couple of years ago, you never imagined yourself becoming a Ford employees, right? And now all three of you are.
I never envisioned myself becoming an employee at all.
Yeah.
I had a job for 4 years in the 80s, and that was it. I've run my own thing ever since.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit new. I'm a contractor technically for Ford. So
yeah,
I still kid myself into thinking, yeah, I'm still, you know, I'm still in charge.
Yeah.
But I came on with two different roles. My role is kind of split between the campus makerspace. That's a makerspace that's available to all the employees at the Palo Alto campus. And then I'm also embedded in D Ford. So I help, not only do I help D Ford with prototyping, once they get past the post-it notes and kind of ideation and human-centered design kind of components, and they're ready to build a physical thing, that's where I step in and help with my expertise on materials and techniques to build it and electronics. So what, you know, everything that might be required. But I also do that same thing for all the other groups. I don't know how many groups there are at Greenfield Labs. That's what this facility here is called. There's a lot. So I'll help them with all their prototyping too. So it's kind of a split role.
Yeah. And Jeff, what were you hired to do?
So I was hired to lead the prototyping team in D Ford Detroit. So there's 4 locations, or, you know, one growing, which is Shanghai, but Palo Alto, London, Shanghai, which is growing, and then Detroit. And so they were looking for a lead for their group of prototypers, which then those prototypers are the sort of prototyping crew that works together with the designers on what Ford calls near and far things. So like 2 to 3 years out, and then like 5 to 10 years out. So when I read the description, you know, I originally interviewed for a director position and wasn't able to do that one, but I did get the lead position. And essentially the descriptions were about the same, but they were like, you know, it's essentially building prototypes for the ideas that we have. And I was like, same with Jim. I was like, wow, this is definitely written for me. But D Ford was still at that time too. They're still growing and changing. So I really did have to beat down the door to, like, get the job. But eventually I got the job, and we hired some more people while I was there, fortunately. So it was a lot of, it has been a lot of fun, really exciting.
Right. So, all this stuff hits, and you guys are a relatively small group within a very, very big company, right?
Yeah, very much.
But when events happened, they kind of called your group and said, "Can you help?" Right, with internally.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, I had been speaking with another person in our group, D Ford, and I was thinking, hey, I mean, we're all thinking this way in various parts of the company, but from my point, the conversation started with my friend Martin Delanis, and I said, I wonder what we can do. As Ford, what can we do? And at that time, I still didn't really understand all the capacity that we could tap into. And a short time later, Martin said, well, be careful what you ask for. The Mayo Clinic called for face shields and a few other things. And so let's start prototyping that. So got together with Will. We started calling our prototyping team together, and we started prototyping face shields, and that was, I think, on a Thursday, like March 19th. And by Friday, we were prototyping face shields. And, and Will could probably share the funny story about how we eventually got to all these doctors in Detroit to help us test our stuff. But it was, that's how it started. And then we found out that the ask was not just from the Mayo Clinic, it was actually from the White House. So that added a little bit of fuel to the fire.
Will, I know the story a little bit, so but I'll let you tell it.
Yeah, yeah. So what's come to be known as Project Apollo is sort of an effort across lots of divisions now at Ford at all sorts of scales. But in the very, very beginning days, after Jeff had sort of talked with Martin and got that initial word, we didn't really necessarily know how big or who was really involved. I mean, if you can imagine, Ford is such a big company, right? It's very hard to, I'll never meet everyone that works at Ford, right? But it's also very difficult to understand, other than in a very high level way, exactly who's doing what at any given moment across the company. I mean, there's so many projects and so much innovation and so much work happening that, we really, we really need to, be super proactive in understanding, all the resources and all the folks and all the activity that's happening at Ford. So when this message came through that, face shields were something that it was thought we might be able to help with, there was a couple things that we did right off the bat as a human-centered design group. And just like really briefly, human-centered design, as I'm learning it, is sort of strikes out from a position of empathy, right, with end users, with humans, surprisingly,
as it
and
should.
yeah, as it should, right? So the root of good design is products and services and systems that enable humans, right? So from that position of empathy, one of the first things that we did was say, okay, face shields, great, got it. Okay, so number one, is that a thing that humans actually need? Healthcare professionals, is that a thing that they need? So we kind of divided up our small team and decided to, start cold calling, combing our networks, asking around, who knows anyone who works in a hospital? And I turned to my wife, who is a hairstylist and runs a salon built in the garage behind our house. And I said, do you have any clients that work in healthcare? And she said, oh yeah. And then she rattled off about 5 or 6 different names of ER doctors and pulmonary specialists and, infectious disease people. And I started to call those numbers. And within about an hour, they had introduced me to the head of the ER at one of the Detroit Medical Center hospitals, Sinai Grace. I was introduced to a manager of innovations at the Henry Ford Health System and a few others. And we were able that afternoon to sort of convene some initial calls, and then actually and we were able to ask questions about is face shields a thing? Is that what you really need in this moment? And it turns out they really were. But we were able to then I think the very important thing is we were able to establish this very immediate relationship in communication channel with people who are right in the thick of it.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
there's an interesting thing. Your wife plays this role is connecting two different networks, right?
Yeah.
And actually not having a professional connection to either one of them herself, right?
Yep.
It's really fascinating. The other say is, I see you're not like the rest of us having trouble getting a haircut during the pandemic, right?
Well, no, it's funny you should say. I got my hair cut last week, but that was the first time I'd had my hair cut since late January. So, yeah.
Well, so you began to get the feedback from healthcare professionals as to what they needed, right?
Yep. And that was really important. So we were able to, first confirm that face shields were in need, and then really start to understand, what was important to get right in a face shield design and what was important to avoid, right? What matters most or what matters least. Sometimes that's in terms of features, what matters most and what matters least is a sort of method and a metric that we use. But we were able to learn some very important things about the way face shields need to be constructed to be effective. And that helped us, simultaneously we had folks in our group looking for design inspiration. And in relatively short order, one of our folks stumbled upon an open source design that was produced by a group called Delve out of the University of Wisconsin, Delve Design. And professor there, a doctor of engineering. Jeff, help me out with the name. Lennon Rogers. There we go, Lennon Rogers. This open source design had published plans. They described briefly some of the work that they had done to, co-design and co-create with medical professionals in the Wisconsin area. And, they talked a little bit about their iterations. So as we were learning about what's important in a face shield, it seemed like this open source design was lining up. And then simultaneously, other folks in our group are trying to sort of find out who's on the Project Apollo team within Ford. And we're invited to a conference call where we're able to sort of put forward this open source design, back it up with the news that we made contact with healthcare professionals right on the front lines. And very quickly, and this really blew my socks off for a 100-year-old industrial megalith like Ford. Very quickly, the folks on the call went, okay, yeah, no, that works, that's great. And one of the folks in manufacturing, a gentleman named Howard Liu, said, well, it sounds like I need to go to one of our suppliers, pick up some materials, and drive down to meet you guys. Where are you? And then that's how we got kicked off. So Jeff and I are, maybe Jeff can talk about this part. Jeff and I set up a temporary base of operations at his makerspace, Omnicore Detroit, because it was a nice neutral ground. It was a controlled space, and our company buildings, our own prototyping lab was, on a lockdown, was shut down to us at that time.
Yeah, I mean, Will and I were actually thinking of stealing the vacuum former from our own lab without asking for permission, and then bringing it to Omnicore, but we opted not to.
Yeah. So Jeff, what was so then the interface was this could be made at Ford, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I think what was really interesting about it is, and sorry, Will, my audio went out, so I couldn't hear most of what you're saying. But I imagine you may have mentioned that we did a lot of prototypes, and I think they're all really interesting and cool. But we also found some open source designs, and so we tested those with the doctors.
Right. You talked about the University of Wisconsin.
Okay, great. And so when we tested those, and we figured those were the way to go, what happened? And Will, did you talk about Howard and changing the materials around? Will,
you're muted.
Yeah, I think I can actually, I can grab something here while you're talking.
Well, yeah, what was really interesting is once we realized there was actually a limit on elastic band material. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to do if there's a global demand on elastic and we can't make into the millions? And I don't think we understood, Will and I at the time, until we talked with Howard. He's like, well, we need enough material to make in the millions because we're going to make millions of these. And this is just a scale that I'm not at all familiar with. And he obviously was. And so he's like, we can't use this material. We've got to use this, this, or this. And eventually he found this elastic band, or this elastic material that goes into door seals called EPDM rubber. And he's like, we can extrude this at any profile you want, so let's test this exactly with the doctors. And so what I thought was super interesting is not only did they change that part of the design, But as they started to go into production, and by the way, in the next day, you know, a Ford partner made thousands of these. And so we made thousands. We were driving them off and dropping them off at hospitals. And this is now like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, you know, in a few days, we had thousands of these. And like a couple days later, 10,000s. A few days later, you know, like hundreds of, I mean, it was, the way it scaled up was unbelievable. And you could see like where the handoff was and where everybody started to do what they excel at and specialize in, and how crazy powerful it was. But they kept making these innovations on both the tools and the materials that they used in the mass design that fit in an automotive, you know, part supply chain. So the other thing they did is they used an interior, one of those little push pins that really frustrate you when you pull them out of interior panels in cars, because you always have to replace them. They're sort of like one-way push pins, and those one-way push pins, they go into the rubber hose for the face mask, so that you can actually, they could actually make them faster and get them out faster if they came disassembled with just the foam on the plastic, and then you got a bag full of, well, actually the pins were already pushed through, and then you would push on the rubber band last, and then it came with some stickers and assembly instructions, which was really cool. So it was, and it was just so interesting to watch that machine mobilize, you know, in a way that it was intended to do. And so, and I think, yeah, I mean, I think that was mind-boggling to us. It's like, what? There's 1 million now? Now there's 5 million? I mean, I think there's like 25 million out in the country now.
25 million face shields?
There's definitely over 20 million.
Yeah, that's amazing. Not just in the Detroit area, but
oh
really,
no, yeah.
globally.
I mean, actually, so the other part of this, which is that a few people at Ford actually built the distribution system for it. So they actually, you know, took a program named Tableau and input all this hotspot data from COVID. And so they would directly send them to hospitals and stuff in the area of the hotspots. So they really focused the face shield distribution on the hotspot areas. And, you know, that would constantly update. So on a, you know, multiple times a day basis, those matching numbers would update. You could also see it on a map. Like you could see like where the distribution was growing. And so that was just awesome too. So it was really cool to see a lot of your teammates they haven't seen in a while in office contribute in ways that they really weren't intending to contribute to our work, but in a way that was contributing to the well-being of the country and helping people on the front lines. And that was only one thing we did. You know, there's 10 other things that we did. And, you know, it was just cool to see that one.
Yeah. So what's next? Like after the PPE, I mean, that goes off, it's being manufactured to some degree from a design problem. You nailed it. It's you've done your job. There was more work to do, right?
Yeah. So, and maybe, you know, I don't want to talk so much, but there are like 10 other things that we worked on, and maybe Jim wants to talk more. You know, Jim probably talks the least of us, but I'd love it if Jim talked about it more.
Yeah. Jim?
Well, in Palo Alto, we were focused on using a snorkeling mask that has the port in using it basically in 3 different ways. Yeah,
something like that. Yeah.
Using that in 3 different ways: as a respirator, as a what's called a positive pressure, a PAPR device, and also a CPAP for different patients and different applications, whether it's for a doctor or a patient or whatever. And, you know, like Jeff was talking about, I've been blown away by the resources that Ford has available to it. You know, if I was going to do a consulting project for a client and they wanted to take an off-the-shelf, you know, snorkel mask from some other manufacturer and make an adapter for it, I would be spending a lot of time measuring the port and, you know, re-engineering, kind of reverse engineering the port to make something that would fit. Ford got this manufacturer to give us the CAD file for their actual mask, you know, their manufactured mask. So all I had to do was go into the CAD file and I could actually take things right off of it. I've also been really impressed by the how Ford really is influencing the way Ford is taking on projects like this. Jeff alluded to this. Jeff, I think you're absolutely right. That I never imagined that a company like Ford would be so nimble and be able to act on things so quickly. That's really been a surprise. But yeah, we worked on, we were validating some of the things like, you know, the face mask, these guys put out the call, hey, is this really able to be made easily? Can you guys take these parts and put them together and see if it works? And what do you think? So we were doing that, working on different respirator designs. We're still doing, I don't know if you guys want to talk about some of the, return to work PPE stuff that we're still working on. That's probably, speaking, Dale, to your question about what's next, that's something that we're working on actively too.
Yeah, and that might be Ford employees, factory employees. It could be
exactly.
people in the community. Yeah, talk about that.
We're all going to have to wear PPE when we go back to the office, and from a human-centered design standpoint, I don't know if you've tried to wear a mask for 8 hours, but it's terrible. It's really, really difficult. So how can we address those problems, make it more comfortable to wear so that people will actually wear it instead of putting it down off their nose so they can actually breathe?
Yeah. Interesting. There was a letter in a local paper from a dentist. He said, I when I started dentistry 40 years ago, I was a wet finger dentist. I put my bare hands in your mouth, and now I wear all the masks. As he said, it was really hard to adjust, but eventually you realize it's protecting you and protecting the patient. You just go along with it. And I think, our workforce is going to have to adjust in a similar way. Jeff, are there any other projects that you can talk about?
Yeah, so it's hard. I think that's the one challenging thing with Ford is sometimes you're not sure what you can or can't talk about. But I can definitely talk about.
This is just between friends here today.
Right. But I think what was really interesting about doing so many of these projects, is that we were picking up as we went, like a lot of things to share back with Ford about what really worked well. I think. One thing that Will and I were doing is we wanted to engage our entire team, which is like 10 people. But, Will and I work closely together. So originally we were doing the face shield. We were like, come on, everybody, let's go to Omnicorp. And then we're like, both of us at night, we're like, wait a minute, is this the right thing to do? Because, when this was at the beginning of the COVID thing. So we called each other in the morning. We're like, I don't think we can bring everybody in. I think we have to, we can do it, and so we didn't bring everybody in. But we did pick people out from time to time to contribute. And I think by keeping the team kind of small and lean, we were able to go really fast. But we would, sort of, at least in our group, be like, okay, everybody, throw up some prototype ideas or go talk to your friends or whatever. But then we would kind of winnow the team down, a little bit and I thought that was pretty fast. I think the other thing was, just being really close to the people with whom we were testing. So when Jim was talking about the scuba mask, we had gotten in touch also with a ventilator technician. So this ventilator technician would come by and he'd bring parts, and I go to the hospital and I go get parts from him, in the parking lot. We would hand each other parts. It looks like we were doing a drug deal, but we were actually passing around ventilator parts. But it was funny how seeing the makers in the hospital who use their parts for ventilation like Legos and putting them together in ways that they weren't necessarily intended, and how we could kind of play with those too and come up with designs that would work. And but we would want to talk to these people working on the ground. I think there was a lot of presumption of I make this thing, it's got to be useful. Well, it's not useful unless you talk to the people that are using it. And so I saw a lot of 3D printed masks around that were terrible. We would get them printed out, but we'd be like, this fits terribly. This doesn't fit to the face. It bumps into my nose. So I think there was a lot of interesting testing, and our value was being really close to the user. And I'd say the other huge thing that Ford had was you had instant street cred when you said, hi, I'm Jeff Sturgis. I'm from Ford Motor Company, and I'm trying to help with PPE. Because after the face shields were out, it was if you said that, you could get just about anything. I walked into the fire department. I said, hi, I'm Jeff Sturgis. Show my badge. I'm from Ford Motor Company working on face masks. And they're like, we'll test your face masks on site for you. Now, fortunately, the fire department had to be down the street from Omnicorp, so it was easier. But Will and I have this great picture with the fire chief, because we gave them a bunch of face shields and he gave us a bunch of fire badges, Detroit Fire Department badges. So, I think there was and that was only on the municipal side. On the corporate side.
Don't let it go to your head, Jeff.
It already has, obviously. Yeah. So it was really cool to just interact with people at a high level at various different companies. They do a lot for us. So,
right.
To make
but I think you bring up a good point that I've seen in conversations. One of the things that's really fascinating is that you have this conversation with the end user, and You know, a lot of the things that are delivered to hospitals, to doctors and nurses and other professionals, they just have to take what they're given. I mean, they didn't order it, someone else did. So they don't really get chance to give feedback. And, you know, and the fact that makers can take the feedback and actually do something and iterate is really remarkable. And it makes it, in some ways, this is a responsive design process. And you know, I've seen it in just in different cities where, you know, it just starts off trying different things, getting feedback. And, you know, you can't do that necessarily with everybody, but you begin to hone in on, you know, real users that have, you know, opinions about what they need, and you learn from that. And then you can later on say, okay, we've nailed it. We could go to injection molding. We'll make them all the same. But it's, I think that's the special thing is you have tools and you have people that are thinking about it and connecting directly with the users, as opposed to a focus group or some specification or something else. It's really kind of a unique thing.
Well, I think also to
Let
that
me-
point, what was valuable, you know, what I think, so the Ford thing, we obviously had scale and we had power and access, and that's all amazing. But I think to Guy's credit and to like the makers that were doing stuff on the ground, the one limitation of Ford is we couldn't like get out just any old mask, because we had, you know, we would expose ourselves a lot if we put out N95s that actually didn't work. Whereas there was a group in Florida that actually took this surgical tool material, and they feel like it actually did a good enough job of protecting like an N95 mask, and their hospital approved of it. So, you know, so it's sort of like if you are able to do that at a micro level, get people to test and approve, that's beautiful, that's great. And I think that was what happened in so many parts of the country, is like there were smaller groups doing that. In the big groups like Ford, they really couldn't do that unless they got the whole FDA, you know, full on, even emergency use approval. And I think that's the value of like the small folks versus the big folks.
Well, let me build on that, because you know, talking about the value of makers, I realize as we're speaking here, it might sound a little, we were able to do an amazing thing because we had, you know, all the resources of Ford Motor Company behind us, right? So, you know, of course, you know, it was a relatively straightforward thing for you to do. You know, congratulations on your privilege in that sense. And some of that is definitely true. But the other thing that struck me, and this was an open question in my mind, honestly, was, okay, so I'm a maker, right? And I'm working out at an enormous, you know, manufacturing powerhouse, you know, a classic icon of a company. Can I contribute? Like when the chips are done, can I really contribute? And the answer resoundingly, I believe, is that makers, all the makers that I know and all the Ford employees that I would call makers, are some of the most valuable contributors, you know, to the company. And our methods and our flexibility, I think, is something that is a real benefit to a group like Ford. So, I mean, if anyone's out there like looking for a gig and wondering, you know, how do you qualify? And this is where my head was at for the longest time, is, you know, I was interested in so many things, and I, you know, fancied that I was pretty good at making stuff, but, you know, I didn't have a ticket that said, you know, Masters of Mechanical Engineering or something. You know, how in the world am I ever going to work in, you know, the auto industry or aerospace or any one of these other things that I, you know, imagine that I would like to be doing, you know, as a grown-up. But though it might be hard, and all of us sort of had to, you know, kind of work on beating down the door. Although, you know, Jeff kindly sort of like jammed his foot in it when he got in and let me squeak in. But when we get to the table, the things that we have to contribute are really, really valuable. And let's see, I've never done Zoom, but if I can just sort of flip my camera around real quickly, I'll show you one of the other projects we were working on, or that I was working on, was prototype replacements for these, you know, N95 mask line, trying to make something reusable and, you know, sterilizable and comfortable. So I'm working on a thread of vacuum form plastic masks, originally meant to attach to existing viral films that you might find in a hospital, you know, something that maybe was in supply. We're working on different versions of those now with this back to work routine that might use other materials. But I mean, look at the tool that I did for vacuum forming, right? This is a hunk of wood with a bunch of Bondo. You know, I needed to make this feature right here, right? So, you know, I found a socket of the right size that fit the filter example I had from Jeff picked up from the hospital, drilled a hole, stuck it in there, boundoed around it, got into TechShop and got a vacuum former going, and it works. It really, really works well. And the value
Yeah.
of that is, we're continuing to iterate. We're now kind of working on some of these designs, coming back to them for another reason, because they're transparent and you can see somebody's mouth, right? You can lip read. So
Yeah.
if for folks that are hard of hearing, now you can see what I'm saying. But we were able to do these things really quickly, really inexpensively, and it's sort of like the rapid prototyping process, right? We can get 90% of the way there, and then present something to the manufacturing powerhouse at Ford and say, this needs some refinement, but it's been proven. It's passed fit tests. It's got efficacy. It's effective, and it's designed with mass manufacturing in mind. And from there, it could sort of springboard to something that has a really, really big impact.
Yeah, that's great. That's really nice to see that that mask. That's interesting. It's kind of your comment though makes me think that this particular time, we're realizing the value of people that can really do stuff, not talk about it, not just I said to my wife the other night, I think we've become a marketing country, more than a manufacturing company. It's like we don't care where it's made, but we can sell it, right? We can create a marketing campaign, ad campaign, and in some ways, when I see what you do, it almost goes back to the origins of Ford, right? Of just tinkering, making something, figuring out how to move it from one at a time, 10 at a time to really thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions. So at the heart of a company like Ford, that's what it's good at, but sometimes it grows, companies grow up to be different and have to reinvent themselves. Are you doing anything besides PPE?
Oh, right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a lot of projects that are still and have been going on in parallel.
I did mean to ask you, did you guys get to meet President Ford? I mean, President Ford, President Trump,
President Ford?
The other day?
I wish. We didn't get to meet him, no, but Will and I did have the privilege of. Put it on, Will.
Did you have your mask on? Oh,
yeah.
see.
We've got the Commander-in-Chief shield that he didn't wear.
Oh, I see. I see. Well, that's a good story.
Yeah, that was the last. That was the last 2 days of my working life.
It was an emergency.
Making a batch of those.
Making a batch. Oh my goodness. They were sterilized, right?
Yeah, Will knows how to sterilize them.
Send me a photo of that. I'm going to put it in my concluding remarks. That's a great one. But I obviously it's put Ford in the spotlight to be able to contribute and to do these things, and that's valuable. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that I've been working on with a small team of folks is trying to actually improve the digital collaboration tools at Ford, because I think that was one thing that with a large enterprise, they tend to have this big tool set, and I think individual makers have really the gift of flexibility. When you're not in a big company, you can just pick whatever tools you want to use, like G Suite or Zoom or whatever. So because Ford definitely has challenges related to intellectual property or something, they have to choose the products, or so we think they have to choose the products that cover that. So I think what I'm working on is trying to figure out in what instances can we have more freedom with that, so that we might be able to make things faster and easier. And that's a challenge with a lot of large companies, I find. So
someone told me that I thought was an interesting remark, that we sort of have tools for really small groups and then sort of tools for really large groups, but nothing that's kind of in the middle, like as your group begins to grow, or even as you want to connect those small groups into other things, it gets harder and harder. It is something we're learning for. I mean, it's a basic question of how does the technology support the new kinds of work we're doing, like Zoom and other things, but also, thank goodness we have a lot of the technology in place, but some of it doesn't, it wasn't designed for this, and we're making it do. Okay, well, I have just a few minutes here to wrap up. I don't see questions coming. Oh, just went. Jeff, could you elaborate on, this is from Leo McElroy. Could you elaborate on which digital tools you're referring to. Are they for project management or actual CAD? You're muted, Jeff.
Thanks.
There we go.
Shout out to Leo, because Leo was actually came to Detroit one summer and shadowed the MakerWorks folks to set up a makerspace at our alma mater, which is Middlebury College. So hi, Leo.
Very
And
good. Welcome,
so the
Leo.
digital tools that I think what are most challenging is whiteboarding and collaboration. One thing D4 does a lot of is working with different people at Ford to kind of get together and come up with ideas. And a lot of that requires collaborative idea sharing and research gathering and so forth, which we normally do on large boards, as many design firms do. So what's very challenging, I mean, there are products like Miro, Mural, Bluescape, and Vision, all these different products. And Ford doesn't necessarily have the luxury of choosing the best one all the time if it doesn't have the security features or the cost or something that works. So that's one example. I think the other example of things that we're trying to do is like, how do we actually do 3D CAD or do VR work, where we can actually work as well remotely as we do in physical space. And I think that is impossible. I think physical space is always critical. I mean, I think it's super important, but it's really just the stuff that allows you to be creative with other people over distance.
Yeah. So let me ask, just kind of closing to Will, what do you think? You mentioned you'd like to take TechShop Dearborn beyond where it was, and give me some ideas there.
Well, I mean, part of what it was, in addition to being an open to public shop, right? We had a really close relationship with Ford when we were, an independent company, and did a number of things that I'm quite proud of, that you can read about in the press, in the archives at this point, to help, sort of foment a little internal cultural revolution, and get some fresh thinking going and encourage innovation. I'd like to think that we helped, and we got some shout outs and kudos from Ford at the time for helping them, hit like record levels of, innovation and measured by the rate of, intellectual property and patents that they had taken out.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one thing that I have that I can freely talk about, and I've told everyone at Ford that'll listen, is that I would love to see TechShop or something very much like it, a large, well-equipped makerspace, be a completely open resource within Ford, in the Ford campus. And Ford it's made some press, and we've actually started now, but it's undergoing a huge campus-wide transformation. Rebuilding the physical buildings and the grounds. And I'd like to see that, a really well-equipped, high-functioning, open access makerspace become a part of that. But we'll see. I got to push it some more.
Yeah, sure. Well, good luck. One of the things I'm fascinated by, and maybe, you think about it too, Jeff, and Will and Jim, is just, I would love people to understand this innovation process that's going on right now as something that's very different than what they think innovation looks like elsewhere. And one of the things I was using an analogy of basketball, but it just, it's almost a lot of passes back and forth in a group of not so much who controls it, but it's just like you're obviously giving control away and getting it back and then pushing it around. But we see this thing of, I was talking to Joseph Prusa this morning about his design, and he puts it out in the world, and people, it isn't like just it. I think in the original ideas, someone come up with a really good design, and we'd have the machine, and it would just print it out, and that's it. But there's all these intermediate steps. It gets modified because of like human testing. People want something different from the end product. It also gets modified because people in manufacturing it say, I could make it lighter. I could make it, stronger. I could do these things.
The material's not available, or it is.
Yeah, exactly. That's another big thing. So it's kind of fascinating how all that, another person I talked to, Adrian Boyer, the original RepRap designer, we kind of used an evolution metaphor, that things that replicate, things that reproduce quickly, we're able to see lots of choices, lots of different ideas out there. Not all of them survive, but it's a different way of thinking. It's not so much and I see this it's not so much like getting it right. It's like doing a lot of things, and then you'll figure out how to get to the next stage, which is, and the next stage and next stage. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but it is a unique process. And I think that's probably what the D Ford means in some ways, is a different way of thinking about innovation.
Well, it's funny too, because I think there is, and I had this too when I came to Ford, like a sort of picture of how it's probably done at Ford. And I think it's actually done a lot more in a maker way than what stereotypically may be thought of. I mean, we certainly saw that in this PPE project, where like we were connecting with people all over the company, and we were hustling and making changes and talking and thinking really quickly. So I think there are times where it smooths out and sort of becomes more ordered and linear and slows down. But usually I feel like that's because it's a thing with like thousands of parts and huge investment. So you sort of have to get certain things really right. So at a certain point, you can't just trial and error. At a certain point, you really got to plan it out. But I know that, that's, I think, part of the reason why D Ford is around, is to introduce it, everywhere, not just, in sort of like some small part of Ford, but like the idea of maker thinking, design thinking, this rapid iteration, getting close to your customer, close to your tools, prototyping. I mean, for Jim, myself, and Will, our biggest push for and we're passionate about, is getting everybody at Ford literate with making. Not just someone who's in manufacturing, but like people in the office manager, people in finance, and everybody loves it. Everybody wants it too, and everybody can be a contributor. I mean, even the person who managed our project, he was the one who mentioned to me, like, I wonder if we can mold a face shield to the face. And I'm like, yes, I can get a piece of dental material, and we can actually like heat that up and stretch around our face. It's called soft EVA. I'm going to go find it. So I think a lot of good ideas combined with the ability to make are really tremendously helpful.
That's great. Well,
yeah, and
gentlemen,
the other thing too.
Yeah, go on.
It always it hits me strong when there's moments like this. But you've got to have a community, even if it's a little small one. You've got to have a community to bounce ideas off of, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a cliche now, right? But like no great inventor has birthed something fully formed out of their own basement in solitude, right? It just doesn't happen that way. And sometimes I fall into this trap where I feel like if I could just sit down and really give it a good think, I'll come up with something, right? But I'm constantly reminded, and I'm really appreciative of the unexpected input that I receive, or the spark of insight that will be produced just in my head if I'm in a little forum of people and we're talking through a problem, right? And that's one of the things that I hope that we carry forward, actually, sort of beyond this pandemic moment within Ford, is this this group that we sort of assembled that meets a few times a week, our little D Ford Project Apollo work team. We sort of overlap in our regular business, but Jim's in California and Jeff and I are in Dearborn, and Martin is part of the business design team. So maybe we bump into each other over a cup of coffee, but we've never really worked so closely. And now that we've been doing that, it just really reminds me of the power of a diverse and creative sort of network of people, no matter the topic or the problem at hand.
Yeah, and thinking about broadening the idea of makers, because I think, as you said once, Dale, at your first Detroit TED, it was like everyone's a maker. And I think it is important to acknowledge the people who don't just make with their hands. I mean, we do, finance people in Ford help mobilize the resources, people, but I mean, there's all sorts of different people that play different roles in a sort of maker sense.
Well, and I think that's what we see in these organizations, even the ones that are being spun up now. It's almost the unexpected people that show. It's like you kind of get the design people, you kind of get the people that know 3D printing, but it's all these other people that get attracted into being part of a team, part of an organization, and it's a multifaceted problem to do these things, and you need different talents and skills. Jim, I'll give you a closing remark here, and we got to wrap up here.
Oh man, put me on the spot. What?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm just, I've had so much fun with these guys and the whole Apollo team. Man, it was like just flat out, stuff.
You're a guy that likes solving problems.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And that's what you got.
But I think,
right?
you know, Will and Jeff are absolutely right. It's like, a lot of times I'll work on client projects by myself and in my basement. I don't have a basement, but, you know, in my shop. But I found it so empowering to bounce ideas, even early ideas, off of other people. They don't get shot down necessarily. Sometimes they do, but usually it's like, well, hey, what if you did like this way instead? And you know, your mind gets blown, and you're like, that's a great idea, and then you pursue it. I think we all have been doing that on this. I hope that Ford learns a lesson from this and makes this much more of an everyday thing. You know, relying on this maker-driven design concept. And I think Jeff's right. That's what D Ford is even here for. It's here to try to influence and change Ford as a company.
Yeah.
So,
well, let's end with that. And thank you, Will and Jeff and Jim. Have a good Memorial Day weekend. And thank you for being part of Virtually Maker Fair.
Thanks very
awesome.
much, Dale.
Thanks,
Take
Dale.
care. Bye.
See ya.